So on Friday night at about 10 to 8, four gunmen entered the Crocus Expo City Mall, which I think we've got up here. So this unit here combines a shopping centre, theatre, restaurants, various other sort of facilities. You know the sort of deal with this thing. It's located on the west side of Moscow. It's right next to the inner ring road, so it's got excellent motorway links. Four gunmen entered that. They worked their way swiftly across the front of the expo into the concert centre, killing indiscriminately as they went. We believe the death toll is in excess of 140 people at this point. There is much footage available online of the attack, which if you can steel yourself to that sort of thing, you can find, which obviously we can't play here. But I do have a recreation, which will briefly cover some of this. So for those listening, we've got the gunmen entering at about 10 to 8, making their way into the main entrance. They move swiftly across the mall, front section of the mall. They go into the main theatre, still firing. This is all within 10 minutes. They use an incendiary device to start a fire and then make a swift getaway, where they then promptly headed towards Ukraine. Several hours later, they were intercepted by Russian security forces. So the interesting thing about this, of course, is that within moments of this attack going around the world, Western media already knew that it was an ISIS attack. They were. I'm not quite sure how they were able to figure that out quite so quickly. It's whatever it is, 3 years now. We still don't know who's done the Nord Stream pipeline.
So is this just that the headlines and all of the journalists immediately began reporting
somehow they
a few
knew.
minutes after? Was this even prior to them being picked up by the Russian security services?
I'm not sure. It might have been, actually. Yeah, it might well have been. So it was very quick. So so we don't know how the Western media were able to diagnose the cause of this quite as quickly as they did, but they did. Now, interesting things around this. Let's talk about some of the factors around this. The US Embassy in Russia put out this notice beforehand. This is a security alert. Avoid large gatherings over the next 48 hours. The embassy is monitoring reports that extremists have imminent plans to target large gatherings in Moscow to include concerts, and US citizens should stay away, which is obviously being picked up in Russia. That has been noted. Now, to give them their dues on this, I know that looks really bad. I suspect it's just because the US are up in everyone's phones.
Potentially, I mean, this is the sort of thing that the international security agencies are supposed to be doing, is to get word of if there's going to be attacks like this and make people aware of it so that they don't get caught up in whatever happens if it does go down.
Yeah.
So this could be an example of the CIA or somebody, the embassies actually coordinating and giving the proper information in a timely manner.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect it was that after what was it, the 9/11 attacks, the US intelligence services realised that they needed to be, or decided that they needed to be in everyone's electronic communication. And I suspect all of these apps, whichever one it is, including Telegram, they have a backdoor into, and they are monitoring actively for anything like this. So I know it looks super bad, but I've got to say my first instinct is probably it's just because they're spying on absolutely everyone, everywhere in the world at all times. So
if that were the case, they'd have a specific date and a location for it, and unless these communications that the terrorists are using are, if they're meeting in person in a basement with no electricity, if they're being
bar room.
It's possible that they're smart enough to get around these spying.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard all sorts of methods for sort of getting around this. Like you share an email account and you put something in draft, but you never send it, or you go on some obscure video game that has a multiplayer function. You communicate in that and stuff like that. So they might have known something was going on Telegram in terms of people sort of meeting up and being recruited and stuff like that, but we're a little bit vague about the sort of the final steps on this.
Sorry for the interruption. I'm Father Calvin Robinson, and you can watch my Common Sense Crusade at 3 p.m. on Thursdays only on lotuseaters.com, where you can sign up for as little as £5 per month. Deus Vult.
But I mean, this was a extremely well organised, swiftly moving, very effective attack. That's not good. And unless
well, it wasn't that organised in the sense that they didn't get away. It was a typical terrorist attack where they're kind of just fighting to the death. They weren't expecting to get out of there with their hides intact.
Well, that's the interesting thing, of course, because if you're from any Western country, you're well used to Islamic attacks at this point. We've had multiple in this country. The defining feature of them is that they don't tend to come out alive. I mean, the only ones I can think...
oftentimes they take themselves out.
Well, yes. A lot of the times they will wear suicide vests to make sure, because the reason they're doing this is because they want their 72 virgins, and they don't want to miss out by inconvenience being jailed for the next 30 or 40 years.
Certainly ISIS, but these guys, as you say, got out and then immediately started to head for the Ukrainian border. Would that just be because it's the closest border that was there for them?
We'll come to that.
All right.
Yes, there are some factors behind that. The only other thing I'd say about sort of jihadis living through this sort of thing is the only ones I can think of is those guys who attacked Lee Rigby. I think they're both still in jail, aren't they?
Well, they surrendered immediately and handed themselves in.
No, I seem to remember one of them rushed the police.
Oh, did
I definitely remember one of them rushing the police and getting shot. But obviously, because we need to do what's right, we immediately then rushed into hospital and put all expensive surgeons on making sure that his life was saved.
Oh, thank God.
Yes. It would have been terrible.
I wondered if the Russian forces have a kind of a super dangerous taser that they can use to capture people. Something that we wouldn't use in this country because it's too inhumane. But were they
probably a bullet? But
I mean, if not just shooting them, if they were really trying to capture them, because they want to know.
They want to extract.
So if they were rather aggressive with the capturing them, they may have been able to knock them out.
Well, from what I've heard, since they've picked them up, they've been very aggressive. I'm sure we'll be getting onto it.
I will certainly mention that. I sort of suspect the reason why they're able to sort of spend 3 hours driving towards the Ukrainian border is because, one, they wanted to know where they were going, but second of all, any nation state, particularly one of that size, can get up in your phone when it wants to. So they were probably monitoring their phones. They had their mics and cameras activated and wanted to see what they said amongst themselves on that 3-hour drive before sort of finally intercepting them. I would imagine something like that happened. So obviously a terrible event. Apart from some perspectives, this was typical of Ukrainian social media at the time. Absolute jubilation from hundreds of people at the death of all of those civilians, which is of course a rather ugly sentiment, but they are in a conflict, and it just goes to show the horrors of war and what it does to people.
This is one of the things that's been brought about by the complete and total state. The way that every member of a nation's population is now considered complicit in the actions of its government. So these are Russian citizens who would have just been out and about shopping at the theatre. They might have been seeing something. They get killed.
A high proportion of teenagers.
Yep, teenagers, people who have nothing to do personally with the conflict other than the fact that they are Russian. And they get killed. And the opposing nation state, their population, because they're all similarly considered complicit, they all celebrate it. It's horrible to see. This isn't how conflict should go.
Really. I mean, I'm not saying this.
I know you're not spoiled. I find it disgusting that nation states see any and all members of the opposing population, whether they're involved or not, as fair game. That's horrifying.
So I'm not saying there's anything particularly deficient in the Ukrainian psyche. I mean, I remember during the COVID era, there were people in this country who would have put me in a concentration camp because I didn't have the you-know-what.
This is all a function of mass media and propaganda. It's infected everyone.
Absolutely right. A Ukrainian spokesman swiftly put out a statement saying that they do not partake in terrorism in Russia, although he may possibly be forgetting that they did the suicide bombing on the Crimea bridge as one.
Is that confirmed as being Ukrainian?
I think they stopped pretending it wasn't at some point. I'm not aware, but they're not doing that anymore.
Was anyone killed in the destruction of the bridge?
Well, the driver.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was a suicide.
Yeah.
So, I think that's. I mean, it's we think of a suicide bombing as
Yes.
typically terrorism, but
Yes.
if it's actually a tactical,
I can't remember, to be honest. There's also the question is whether the driver knew that he was what exactly he was signing up for.
Oh.
Then, of course, there was the car bomb on Dugan's daughter in Moscow. Yes.
For terrorist attacks, what I was thinking about this story, if this had happened at any other time, or to any other country in Europe, indeed, other than during this war with Ukraine, no one would think it was suspicious at all that ISIS wanted to attack Moscow, and that they did, and that they were effective at doing it. It's sort of just a typical thing that happens every few years in Europe. It's only because Russia is at war with Ukraine that we have to even give it a sniff test.
Yes. I mean, so Russia definitely has a long history of conflict with Islamists. I'll definitely be mentioning that. But the other thing you point about, if this had happened at any other time, would we be putting up Russian flags on our bios?
Yeah, maybe.
Would Downing Street be lit up with a Russian flag if this happened at any other time?
Would we be having to talk about the blowback on innocent Islamists? Things like that.
Yeah. So one of the gunmen was captured. This is the tamest video that I could find, but here he is surrounded by Russian security services. I better pause that there just in case we get flagged for anything. But one of the people that I would least want to be in the entire wide world.
Well, if this is one of the men who tried to mow down hundreds of people and did successfully mow down dozens of people, then
yes,
shaking and cowering in fear is not going to get you anywhere. On the F around and find out scale, I think you've surpassed anything.
So late last night, we got some updated photos of these guys being presented in court in Russia, and they looked like they had aged about 30 years in one day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they are still in their honeymoon period of their time with the Russian security services, because they still need to put them in front of cameras. I think they are going to have a very eventful next 14 months or so.
If it lasts that long.
Yes. I mean, it's just extraordinary that they thought that they were going to get away with this. And this is the weird thing that everybody's noting is Islamists almost always follow the pattern of shouting about Allahu Akbar while they're doing it, and make sure they're dead. And these guys did neither of this. They claim to have done it for money, about 1 million rubles, which is about 10 grand. So they're prepared to do all. So they're clearly very low IQ individuals, because if you thought there was even the remotest possibility that you were going to get captured by the Russians, at a minimum you'd have your testicles removed before you went on this journey. I think he's going to be regretting that for some time.
I think 10 grand. I saw that figure from RT. I tracked.
Yeah.
I don't know what the source is for that, but that's one of the things that made this seem very dubious. This story that RT put out. Russia, is it Russia Today?
Yeah.
They have a bias. I know our media has a bias too.
Yeah.
They've got a different bias. And the idea that these, that on top of whatever ideological reasons they have for doing this, that you'd also just sweeten the deal by giving them, like £10,000 for this guy, $10,000, whatever. Like what?
Yeah,
what is that for this guy?
I think he's a Tajikistanian. We're going to call up the map in a minute, but he is from a part of the world where actually that is fairly significant money.
Well, also, once again, if it was an ISIS attack, if it was Islamists,
well, you wouldn't need to pay.
Yeah, why would they need the money in the first place?
Yeah, they'd want the money up front so they can do all their sinning and strip clubbing and all the rest of it beforehand, because then it all gets wiped clean on the day when they sort of martyr themselves. So you're right, Poe, that at any other time this might seem simpler. It might seem a straightforward sort of Islamic attack.
Furthermore, just to make this point, I know that Russia is at a very sort of vulnerable place. That they're spread thin. Their forces, their resources are spread very thinly at the moment. So it could be ISIS thought this was an opportunistic time, to strike this target in particular. Russia is their enemy, and it makes it makes even more sense that they would do it during a war with Ukraine. It could be that the Ukrainians knew that some branch of some part of the Ukrainian forces, intelligence, whatever, knew that it was happening and let it happen, or they said that you can escape through here.
They
or
have
use some
apparently
money.
been disrupting a number of other similar sort of cells. Putin went on live TV a few days prior to this, and he's claimed that Ukraine had switched to primarily a terrorist-based attack approach, including shelling towns, assaults on government officials, and attempts to recruit terror cells. And he said that the FSB were actively disrupting a number of terrorist cells. I know there was one in I think a basement of a synagogue or something. They had burst into and find a large cache of weapons. So he claims to be regularly disrupting this sort of activity at the moment, and he claims it's coming from Ukraine. What raised eyebrows is something like this. So if you remember, about a month ago, interestingly enough, all these guys that have been captured, they say they were recruited about a month ago. Anyway, about a month ago, Victoria Newland, senior honcho at the State Department, she said this:
"With this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the east, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield. And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield."
The big grin on her face there when she says nasty surprises. What was probably more key in that was the phrase asymmetric warfare. What does she mean by asymmetric warfare? Here we are with the RAND Institute, and they helpfully give us a definition of what they mean by asymmetric warfare. So they say the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the war in Afghanistan are amongst the best-known recent examples of asymmetric warfare, conflicts between nations or groups that have disparate military capabilities and strategies. RAN instigates political and military responses to the impacts of counterinsurgency, terrorism, and other forms of irregular warfare. So we're pretty clear on what asymmetric warfare includes.
So could you count? Could you count like the guerrilla warfare of the Viet Cong as a form of asymmetric warfare?
Yeah, I think that would fall under this definition. But it certainly does include acts of terrorism. And there was Vicky Newland saying that she was supplying funds to the Ukraine for the purpose of asymmetric warfare, which does include terrorism. So, we are never going to know for sure who was behind this, but you can see why eyebrows have been raised over this sort of thing. Coming back to your point, Poe, about the sort of Islamist problem that Russia does have. Yes, Russia does have a reasonably large border with Ukraine. So for those of you who are listening, we're now looking at a map of Russia. It has an absolutely extraordinarily long border with Kazakhstan. I believe that's the longest land border in the world. It's almost 5,000 miles long. And through Kazakhstan, you then basically get into all the stans. And they can be the bits that are a little bit Islamic-y.
Is that the academic term?
I think that is the academic term. Yes. So a number of these chaps seem to have come from this particular stan, Tajikistan, and of course, long before that, over on this bit over here, Russia had its conflict with Chechnya, which I think is around about that bit there. Again, that consisted of Chechen nationals, but also those who wanted to sort of see an Islamic state as well. They were sort of all bundled in that. So basically, after Russia won that, if you were an Islamist in sort of this part of Russia, you couldn't stay there. So you had to go off and find something else with yourself to do. And a lot of them ended up joining, ISIS, Al Qaeda, a lot of these groups. So there were a lot of people with Russian connections who were sort of left. And basically what's happened since is those guys have then gone back and joined in with Ukraine. They've thrown their lot in behind Ukraine. So this is not a wild conspiracy statement. This is the banner that a lot of the times they fly under. A mesh up of the two, of ISIS and the United Caucus.
So this would be a case of common cause. They are joining in they could be joining in the Ukrainian effort just so that they can get their own territory back.
Yeah, I mean,
being huge supporters of Ukraine.
Callum was showing me this morning videos of them basically fighting the Russians and then playing the ISIS music over the top. You know, these promotional videos that they do. So they pump out a whole bunch of these. And this article here, I mean, whenever that's from well over a year ago, pointing out that hundreds of Al Qaeda militants have arrived in Ukraine from Syria because, their enemy is the Russians, so it's the opportunity to sort of go back into that and carry on the warfare there. And of course, that is their that is effectively their profession. So look, we will probably never know who was behind this attacks, just like we don't know who was behind the Nord Stream pipeline attack. We don't know who was behind the Las Vegas shootings attack. You know, that seems to have gone very quiet. If you remember, ISIS claimed responsibility for that as well, although that's been debunked since. It was just ISIS was jumping on the bandwagon with that one. But it is a bit weird that they didn't make sure they got themselves martyred, because that's the entire route to your 72 virgins. A number of those guys have been identified as having previously worked for the Ukrainian army as recently as last year. Presumably they were quit and decided to pursue another career path, and the Ukrainian army just said, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we don't need you at the moment. You can go. They're obviously very low intelligence individuals, as if you've watched any of the clips. So clearly there was somebody else steering this. And the interesting question, of course, is who was it that was going to be steering this? And, you know, we've talked about, you know, some of the people that might be motivated to do so. The only thing I would say on this is if people are wondering why there might be a motivation to do this sort of thing, remember what Israel did after a similar attack. They, some say, massively overreacted, and that massive overreaction cost them a considerable amount of international support. What did the US do after a similar attack, 9/11? They massively overreacted. The result of that was to lose considerable international support. The trouble that the collective West has been having with Russia is that the global majority, the global South, whatever you want to call them, have generally backed Russia. So if they can be pushed into an action which costs them considerable international support, that is certainly a win, some would say, for the others behind this. So, you know, what you're looking for is people with the means, motive, and opportunity to carry out some of this. So, you know, I've got no hard answers on this. Personally, I am just extremely grateful that during these, you know, difficult times of international strife, that the West doesn't have wide, open, unvetted borders, so that anyone in the world can gain access to our shopping centres.
Well, that was fun.
Yes. Should we go on to something a bit more fun?
I think just to round off that segment, I believe that using simplest explanation, I think probably ISIS did it. I think the only question that's in my mind is how complicit Ukraine was in, like, not stopping them, like not really trying very hard to stop them.
Ukraine are paying ISIS. They're funding and paying them to fight. So, and that's just open.
Yeah, no, I mean, but in terms of like how, like who knew, what people want to know is who is the highest up person in Ukraine who knew that Russian civilians in Moscow in a shopping center were going to die.
Exactly.
Because there's killing, you know, there's paying soldiers to fight other soldiers. And the whole point and the reason we're talking about this is that is different to paying someone to go in with a machine gun and kill lots of people who are shopping.
The questions that come off of your question would be if that person was high, were they high enough to be able to do anything about it? And if they were, why didn't they?
Yeah.
And if maybe they did, and ISIS decided to go rogue on this one. There's a lot of questions that could be asked.
Hi folks, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can do so for £5 a month at lotus.com, because of course we are demonetized on YouTube for reasons unknown. But if you do go and support us, then you can watch Josh's contemplation series. And in this particular episode, Josh is examining America and wondering why it's such a magical place. And if you'd like further updates from us, you can go to Twitter and follow us at lotuseaters_com.